Walter Gaines had lived there for decades. At 56, he was known as a man of routine and reliability. By day, he ran a modest auto repair shop, a place where locals trusted him with their cars and sometimes their stories. He was a fixture in the community, the kind of man who remembered your birthday and waved at neighbors from his porch swing. Beside him for 28 years was Laverne, his wife, a warm, grounded nurse whose heart had known both healing and heartbreak. She carried herself with grace, especially after losing her sister years earlier. So when Laverne's 23-year-old niece, Imani Terrell, needed a place to stay after college, there was no hesitation. She was family, and in this house, family meant everything. But no one, not even Laverne, could see what was unraveling behind closed doors. An affair rooted in deceit, a betrayal that tore bloodlines apart, and one fatal night that ended everything. Because some secrets don't just ruin marriages, they kill. This story will leave you breathless and questioning the thin line between love, betrayal, and revenge. If you're drawn to real-life psychological crime stories that expose the darkest corners of the human soul, subscribe to True Crime Stories Arena. Tap the bell and join us every week as we uncover truths no one dares to speak. It started with good intentions. It always does. When Imani Terrell arrived at the Gaines home in the early spring of 2022, she came carrying little more than a duffel bag and a trail of grief. At just 23, she'd buried both parents. Her mother, Laverne's sister, had succumbed to cancer just months before. Her father, distant even in life, had passed years earlier under different circumstances. Alone, raw and directionless, Imani needed family, and Laverne, she had always harbored guilt over how little she could do for her sister during her final years. The cancer came quick, and the collapse of Imani's life came even quicker. Laverne saw this young woman not just as a niece but as a second chance, a way to honor a bond severed too soon. So Imani was welcomed into the Gaines home with open arms. A warm room was prepared upstairs, the guest bathroom restocked with fresh towels and lavender soap, family dinners resumed with an extra plate. And Walter embraced her too. He gave her rides to job interviews, checked her car, even taught her how to balance a checkbook. He'd say she reminded him of a younger version of Laverne. At first, Imani kept mostly to herself, quiet, gentle, eyes that always looked down. But over time she began to settle in, and in the stillness of that settling, something began to shift. They say trauma has a way of lingering in a house, but sometimes it isn't the trauma, it's the people. A few months after Imani's arrival, things began to feel different, subtle at first, unspoken, but undeniable. Walter, the once dependable man whose evenings were spent watching TV with Laverne or tinkering in the garage, started coming home late. He'd claim extra shifts at the shop, emergency call-outs, late-night supply runs, but something was off. The scent of unfamiliar cologne that clung to his shirts, the distant look in his eyes, as if he were there but thinking of someplace else, or someone else. Laverne noticed it immediately. The tension in the room when Walter entered, the way he suddenly avoided eye contact, how his touch disappeared from small places, her shoulder in passing, her hand on the porch swing. And it wasn't just her. Neighbors started talking. The couple across the street, who'd once described Walter as rock solid, said they now saw him pacing his driveway late at night, phone pressed tight to his ear. His laughter was gone, his patience thinner than ever. At church, where the Gainers were once known for arriving hand in hand, Walter began showing up alone or not at all. He was quieter, more irritable, and then came the explosion. It was at a Sunday barbecue. A neighbor's toddler accidentally scratched the paint on Walter's old Ford truck, a truck he once said was just a thing. But that day he erupted, red-faced, shouting. Everyone froze. It wasn't about the truck, it was about the man. Something inside him had shifted, and while no one could prove what exactly was going on, Laverne, in the privacy of her bedroom, began to ask herself a question she never thought she'd have to ask. Who is this man I married? Walter's world, once so tightly held together by duty, marriage, and reputation, was beginning to unravel, and at the center of the unraveling was Imani. She was always polite, always quiet, always grateful, but when Walter smiled at her, it lingered too long, and when she laughed at his jokes, it felt rehearsed. No one dared say it aloud. Not yet, but under the surface, something poisonous was starting to pulse through the walls of the Gaines household, and the white picket fence that had once kept danger out was now keeping something darker in. By midsummer, the warmth inside the Gaines home had turned humid with unspoken tension. What started as care a protective uncle figure guiding his vulnerable niece, morphed into something far more dangerous. It began with glances, lingering, unreadable. Then came the conversations, longer, late night, behind closed doors. Imani would sit close, her knees tucked under her, eyes fixed on Walter as if he were the only man on earth. And Walter had never been looked at that way before, not in years. Laverne, busy with double shifts at the hospital, trusted them both. She saw Imani as family, wounded, quiet and in need of love. She saw Walter as constant, unchanging, safe. She didn't see the storm building. Somewhere in the stillness of those shared evenings, mentorship slipped into dependency. Imani began relying on Walter for more than advice. She needed his validation, his attention, his presence. And Walter, decades older, began needing her too. There's no polite way to describe what happened next. The line blurred, and then it broke. What began in whispers soon escalated into physical intimacy. In that house, under that roof, while Laverne slept, Walter, once the symbol of discipline and respect, became a man ruled by impulse. Imani, barely a woman and deeply fractured by loss, clung to him like a lifeline. But this wasn't love. It was a sickness, and like all sicknesses left unchecked, it began to spread. Imani changed. No longer meek, she grew possessive, jealous of Laverne, irritable when Walter pulled away, manipulative when he tried to set boundaries. Walter, in turn, became obsessed. He stopped hiding his favoritism. He bought Imani small gifts, bracelets, perfume, a new phone. And each time she smiled, his guilt receded into something darker, justification. But secrets, especially ones this toxic, don't stay hidden for long. It started with silence. Laverne began to notice the hush that fell whenever she entered the room. The laughter between Walter and Imani would stop abruptly. Conversations would shift awkwardly. At first she chalked it up to generational differences. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe she was overthinking. But the signs kept stacking. Walter no longer touched her. Not a kiss, not a glance. He spent more time in the garage than in their bedroom. And Imani stopped looking her in the eye altogether. One evening, after a long shift, Laverne walked into the kitchen and found Imani laughing, loud, flushed. Walter stood just a bit too close, his hand on her back, guiding her to the fridge like a prom date. That night, Laverne couldn't sleep. By morning, her hands were trembling as she picked up Walter's phone. He was in the shower. Imani was out for a walk, and something inside Laverne, the nurse, the wife, the sister, told her to look. She did, and what she found shattered her. Thread after thread of text messages, long messages, private ones. I miss you already. Last night, I'll never forget it. Don't worry, she won't find out. And worst of all, hearts, smiling emojis. Her name, signed, Imani. Laverne's knees buckled beneath her. She wasn't just betrayed, she was humiliated. By her husband, by her blood. That evening, she didn't wait, she didn't scream. She sat across from Walter in the den, her fingers trembling around the phone. She handed it to him, quietly. He didn't deny it, didn't flinch, just stared at the floor, then nodded. Yes, he whispered. It happened. No excuses, no fight, just blank guilt. Laverne's voice cracked. Why her? He didn't answer. Because how do you explain something so vile, so unnatural? Laverne walked out of the room in silence. She didn't cry, not yet. Her body hadn't caught up to the trauma, but Walter wasn't done. In the weeks that followed, he insisted it was over, that it meant nothing, that he'd made a terrible mistake. But it wasn't over, because Imani wasn't done with him, and neither was the darkness now festering in that once honorable home. Behind that white picket fence, a chain had formed, forbidden, tangled, unbreakable, and somewhere deep inside, the clock was ticking towards something far more final. It happened just 3 days after Laverne discovered the affair, a rainy Wednesday morning in late August. Walter left the house before sunrise, claiming he had an early client waiting at the shop. The roads were slick with mist, the air unusually heavy. At 7:42 a.m., a 911 call came in, a single vehicle accident on Briar Creek Road. A silver Buick had veered off the street and slammed into a sycamore tree. The front end was crushed like paper. The driver, Walter Gaines, was pronounced dead at the scene. Initial reports listed it as an accident, a mechanical failure, possibly the brakes. No witnesses, no other vehicles involved. Just a quiet, deadly crash on an empty road. But Laverne wasn't convinced. To the rest of the world, Walter's death looked like a tragic fluke. To her, it looked like a consequence, because Walter wasn't careless with cars. He lived under hoods. He breathed diagnostics. He'd just replaced the pads and rotors weeks ago. And yet he didn't stop, not even once. When the officer delivered the news to Laverne on her front porch, she didn't cry. She asked one question: who else touched that car? Laverne refused to let it rest. She told investigators what she had discovered: the affair, the texts, the emotional fallout. At first it was treated as grief-fueled suspicion, but something about her calm persistence made one detective listen. A second inspection of Walter's vehicle was ordered, this time deeper. What they found was chilling. The brake lines weren't just worn. They had been tampered with, deliberate, precise, almost professional. A small incision, barely detectable, enough to weaken pressure without total failure, until it mattered most. Now the crash wasn't just a tragedy, it was a possible crime, and then came the footage. A neighbor's motion-activated security camera facing the alley behind the Gaines residence. Timestamp 11:36 p.m. The night before the crash. A figure, hoodie pulled up, walking toward the garage. Female, petite, Imani. She stayed inside for 11 minutes, left quietly. Did she have a key? Did Walter know? Or was he asleep while she moved through the darkness like a shadow? When detectives brought the footage to Laverne, she didn't blink. "I knew it," she whispered. She couldn't have him, so she destroyed him. Walter's funeral drew half of Durham. Friends, family, old customers from the auto shop. They all came. They all grieved, but none more visibly than Imani. She arrived late, eyes swollen from tears, draped in black. She threw herself against Walter's casket, sobbing, whispering things no one could quite hear. And Laverne had seen enough. As the service ended and mourners began to drift toward the exit, she approached the pulpit. Her voice sharp but steady. "I want everyone here to know the truth," she began. "My husband is gone, not because of God's will, not because of fate, but because someone here wanted him all to herself." Gasps echoed through the chapel. Heads turned, eyes locked onto Imani. Imani froze, then shook her head slowly, frantically. "No, no, I didn't." But the damage was done. The crowd murmured. Whispers turned into stares, and Imani unraveled. She left the chapel in tears. That night, she was seen at a bar downtown, alone, drinking, shaking. Over the following days, neighbors reported strange behavior, doors slamming, screaming behind closed windows. Paranoia. Imani had become a ghost of herself, and Laverne, her sorrow hardened into resolve. Because mourning wouldn't bring Walter back. But justice, that might at least mean something. And Laverne Gaines wasn't done yet. There's a certain quiet that settles after a funeral, a strange stillness where grief and rage meet in silence. But for Laverne Gaines, silence didn't mean surrender. Alone in a house that once breathed with routine, she began her own investigation, not because she didn't trust the police, but because she needed something deeper than justice. She needed truth and revenge. She started with Walter's phone. Buried deep in deleted folders were drafts of unsent texts, fragments of emotion never shared. "This has to stop. You're too young. It's wrong. I made a mistake. I love my wife." And then screenshots, photos of Imani, selfies, some innocent, some not, time-stamped, marked. Next, she turned to Imani's old room. After the funeral, Imani had packed up and vanished, leaving behind a half-made bed, a drawer of hair ties, and a small wooden box tucked behind a stack of books. Inside were handwritten letters, some addressed to Walter, some never mailed, and all of them seething. "I see how you look at her. You're choosing her again. If I can't have you, no one can. You said you loved me. I believed you." The words pulsed with desperation, obsession, control. Laverne sat in that empty room for hours, surrounded by lies written in ink, and she realized something chilling. Walter had tried to end it. He was pulling away, and Imani wouldn't let go. Grief doesn't always weep. Sometimes it whispers. In the weeks that followed, Laverne transformed. No longer the kind-hearted nurse, no longer the grieving widow. She became something else entirely. Her nights were spent watching, following Imani from a distance, making note of her routines when she left, when she came home, who she spoke to. And then the calls began. Blocked numbers, heavy breathing, silence on the other end. Sometimes a single word: murderer. Imani started to unravel. Neighbors noticed her standing in the middle of her yard at night, whispering to herself. Others saw her talking to people who weren't there. She stopped going to work, stopped answering calls. Instead, she drank, a lot, whiskey for breakfast, vodka by dusk. She told friends she was being watched, that Laverne was everywhere, outside her window, across the street, even in her dreams, but no one believed her. And that's exactly how Laverne wanted it. She was breaking Imani down, piece by piece, psychological warfare, slow, precise, untraceable, because sometimes justice isn't served in a courtroom. Sometimes it's carved out of madness. Then came the invitation, a white envelope slipped under Imani's door, handwritten in Laverne's familiar cursive. "Let's talk, one last time, for closure. L." Imani hesitated, her hands trembled, but part of her, perhaps the part still aching for family, for forgiveness, walked right into the trap. She arrived just after dusk, pale, thin, frantic eyes darting around the porch. Laverne greeted her with warmth, smiled, said nothing about the past. Instead, she led her to the kitchen. 2 cups of tea, chamomile and honey. "Drink," Laverne urged. "Let's put this behind us." Imani sipped slowly, the bitterness masked by sugar. Minutes passed. Her eyes grew heavy, her limbs slack. Laverne watched her closely, and then her phone buzzed. It was the detective. "We just confirmed Imani's fingerprints are on the brake cylinder," he said. "She tampered with the car. It wasn't an accident." Laverne stared at Imani across the table, drooping, slurring, fading fast. Proof. Finally, she had it now. Confirmation that her husband's death wasn't chance. But what she didn't know yet was that the storm wasn't over. Because as Imani slipped into unconsciousness, one last thought crept into Laverne's mind. If she dies here, am I still the victim? And outside, the night deepened, silent, complicit, watching. Imani Terrell woke up in a fluorescent-lit hospital room, strapped to an IV and gripped by nausea, not from the medication, but from the weight of everything that had finally collapsed. Her body was weak, her mind foggy, but her truth was clearer than ever. 2 detectives stood at the foot of her bed, expressionless, professional, ready. "Imani Terrell," one of them began, "you are under arrest for the manslaughter of Walter Gaines." She didn't resist. She didn't even ask why, because she already knew. At the station, she broke down during the interview. Her voice trembled as she admitted what investigators had already pieced together. Yes, she had tampered with the brakes. Yes, she had gone into the garage that night. But she insisted it wasn't to kill Walter. "I just wanted him to stay," she whispered. "He said he was leaving me. He said he was going back to her. I thought if I could scare him, if he thought his car had problems, maybe he wouldn't go. Maybe he'd talk to me one more time." Desperation, not malice. Fear, not intent. But Walter was still dead, and actions have consequences. The trial didn't drag. The evidence was overwhelming, the confession clear. Imani stood silent as the judge read the sentence, 15 years in prison for manslaughter. The courtroom was quiet, no gasps, no sobs, just the cold hum of finality. Laverne sat in the gallery, hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't cry, she didn't smile. For a moment, just a moment, she felt something close to relief. Walter was avenged. The truth had come out. But bitterness has a long shelf life. And it wasn't long before the scales tipped again. Someone had spoken, an anonymous letter sent to the district attorney's office. A detailed account, a timeline, a name, Laverne Gaines, hospital-grade sedatives, an unreported overdose. Investigators re-examined the teacup found at the scene. They reviewed Imani's toxicology report. And slowly the story of the peace offering began to unravel. The knock came on a cold October morning. Laverne opened the door to the same detective who'd once handed her the truth about her husband's crash. Only this time she was the one being questioned. What began as denial cracked under pressure. Laverne's composure, so tightly held for months, finally broke. She confessed. "I didn't want to kill her," she said. "I just wanted her to sleep, to know what it felt like to be powerless." But the law has little room for symbolic justice. She was charged with attempted murder and reckless endangerment. At her sentencing hearing, Laverne stood before the judge, not as a grieving widow, but as a woman consumed by vengeance. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The courtroom emptied quietly, the weight of the story leaving no room for outrage. 2 women, 1 man, 3 lives shattered by a chain of secrets, lust and betrayal. Imani now spends her days behind steel bars, haunted by the love she tried to force. Laverne counts time in a prison cell, remembering the man who broke her heart, and the part of herself she lost trying to destroy his mistress. And Walter Gaines, he lies in the ground, gone not from fate, but from a storm of his own making. Behind the white picket fence they once called home, nothing remains but echoes. Justice came, but it didn't heal, it only marked the end. In the end, the community of Durham didn't just bury Walter Gaines, they buried the image of a perfect family. Amani sits in a correctional facility, her youth rotting away. Laverne spends her days staring at prison walls, haunted not by her actions, but by the silence left behind. This was more than an affair. It was a ticking bomb of desire, betrayal, and generational trauma. When the lines between protector and predator are blurred, and when vengeance becomes more intoxicating than justice, no one escapes clean. And in this story, everyone paid the ultimate price. Subscribe to True Crime Stories Arena for more gripping tales of secrets, betrayal, and the dark truths hiding behind everyday smiles. Don't just watch, investigate with us.